everybody, it's Kresser. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. I'm sure by now many of you have heard about the recent study that came out of UCLA that looked at sleep patterns in 3 different hunter-gatherer groups. And the way that the media is reporting on this study suggests that despite a lot of recent evidence and claims that humans need 7 to 8 hours of sleep to function properly, which I've been an advocate of in my book and elsewhere, that in reality, our ancestors may have only slept 5.5 to 6 hours a night and get even less sleep than most of us in the industrialized world get today. So I wanted to invite Dan Pardi, a sleep expert that we've had on the show before, back to discuss this study and its implications for those of us that are living in the industrialized world. Dan is an entrepreneur and researcher whose life's work is centered on how to facilitate healthy behaviors in others. He's the CEO of humanos.me and dansplan.com, health technology companies that utilize the loop model to sustain health behaviors, which he developed to help people live a healthy lifestyle in the modern world. He does research with the Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Department at Stanford and the Departments of Neurology and Endocrinology at Leiden University in the Netherlands. His current research looks at how sleep influences decision-making. Dan also works with Naval Special Warfare to help the most elite fighters in the world maintain vigilant performance in both combat and non-combat conditions. You can follow him at Dan's Plan Health on Twitter. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk to Dan about sleep. This episode of Revolution Health Radio is brought to you by 144.me. 144 is a diet and lifestyle reset program I created to help you dial in the 4 pillars of health: nutrition, physical activity, sleep, and stress management. Whether you want to lose weight, boost your energy, treat a chronic health problem, or just maintain your current good health and extend your lifespan, these are the 4 areas you need to focus on before anything else. In the 144 program, I walk you through every step of the process, from cleaning out your pantry and shopping for the right foods, to recipe and meal plans, to video demos of workouts that you can do at home without any special equipment, to guided meditation and stress management programs, to daily sleep tips, to personalized recommendations for what to do after you finish the reset. 144 is a great option whether you're just getting started with this stuff or you've been on the path for a while. In fact, I do a 144 myself 3 or 4 times a year to hit the reset button and give myself a boost. To learn more about how 144 can help you achieve your health goals, head over to 144.me. Okay, now back to the show. Dan, welcome back to the show. Pleasure to have you on again.
Chris, thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
So I invited you to come back on the show so we can talk about this new study that just came out that's making a lot of waves in the media by Jerome Siegel. I think he was the lead author from UCLA. And as I'm sure most people who are listening to this have heard, the way the media is approaching it typically is, hey, contrary to popular belief, we got a lot of people who've been saying that our ancestors got more sleep than us, maybe 8 or 9 hours a night. And this new study shows that, on the contrary, many of them actually get as much or even less sleep than we do in the West. And so we basically just need to throw out everything that we knew before about sleep and ancestral sleep patterns. And anyone who's out there just sleeping, 5.5, 6 hours a night of sleep is fine, because this is what these 3 hunter-gatherer cultures do. So what's wrong with that picture, Dan, and way of interpreting that study, which we've seen over and over now in the media?
Yeah, it was a huge popularity last week, and for good reason. It's a really interesting study, but it's also easy to misinterpret. So the question I get most regularly and probably the easiest question to ask is, how much sleep do you need? And it's actually one of the hardest questions to answer because it's dependent on several things. But I'll talk a little bit about the details of the study, then we can talk about its interpretation. So as you mentioned, there were 3 hunter-gatherer groups that were analyzed, and they were analyzed through what's called wrist actigraphy. So this is a wrist-worn device that will look at movement patterns, sleep patterns, and then some new ones also will look at light. So just by wearing it, it has a light meter. And what they can do is then they can look at periods where they will use that motion data to then predict, okay, were they asleep or not? Maybe what type of sleep were they in? And then what was their physical activity patterns like? And then also what kind of light exposure did they get? So the three groups that were studied were the Hadza, which are foragers of the northern Tanzania, the San, which are hunter-gatherers of Namibia. They've been in the Kalahari for tens of thousands of years. And then the Samani, which are semi-nomadic people out of the Andean foothills in Bolivia. And so those are the three groups that were evaluated. And they were all relatively fit. And I do have some comments to make about what fit means for fit and healthy. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just, while I'm on that point, I'll just mention their fit and healthy people might be healthier and fitter than our people. And the fitness was actually was discussed a little bit in the study, but because unhealthy people in hunter-gatherer tribes will die young or can, then a lot of people that have health issues are kept alive through modern medicine, which is a great thing. But it doesn't mean that the population, there might be some population differences when we say normal healthy subjects in a study with hunter-gatherers and then in a study within the United States or some other developed country.
Right, because previous work has shown that hunter-gatherers are typically much healthier overall than Westerners when you look at measures like body mass index and oxygen consumption and vision and bone density and things like that.
Yeah. So you have to take that into consideration when you're thinking about, these terms that are used to describe actually different groups, normal, healthy.
Right.
It's relative.
Not to mention the vast difference in their just about everything about their lives, that can be measured. Yeah. Just to throw this in. So I was driving back from San Francisco just now and was listening to Science Friday recording from last week. And they were interviewing this psychologist who studies the psychological and physiological impact of the built environment. And they actually had people take these guided walking tours through New York City and the Lower East Side, among other cities. And they had a skin
bioimpedance?
Yeah, bioimpedance monitors to measure the activation of the sympathetic nervous system. They had other heart rate variability monitors. They had a number of monitoring systems to see what was happening to their nervous systems as they went through these different kinds of environments. And so they'd have them stand like in the middle of a busy intersection, not in the street, but like on the center divider. They'd have them stand inside of green space park. They'd have them stand like at the entrance of a building, different kinds of buildings. And what they found, unsurprisingly, was that the different environments profoundly affected the nervous system, and in a dramatic way. Like even just 2 or 3 minutes sitting on a park bench in green space, like dropped the sympathetic arousal by a huge amount, really unexpected, actually, even to the researchers. So it just stands to reason to me that, the nervous system of people in our highly manufactured, built environment, industrial environment, is going to be profoundly different than the nervous system of people living in these more traditional settings.
I did not hear that. I'm going to go find it and listen to it, but it's also very consistent with other reports where you see things like ego depletion happening, which is basically the sapping of your willpower. That happens a lot less when you're exposed to natural environments or in natural environments. So if you're doing the same sort of depleting task, if you're in a natural environment, it'll happen less. Right. So, just one more example about how, our physiology evolved in a condition that's very different than what's normal now for many people. And so, that's really, really interesting.
So there's the context, everyone. And Dan's going to continue after I've interrupted him 6 times and tell us more about the study.
No, it's a really crucial point. So thank you for mentioning it. So let's see. So they examine their sleep duration and timing. And so, as you've probably heard me say before on your show, and even the article that I wrote, so timing and duration are very key. And they're independent. So timing duration is easy. It's the amount of sleep that you get over the course of a 24-hour period. Timing is when that sleep is occurring within the 24-hour period. Okay. And they looked at both of these factors in relationship to natural light and ambient temperature, and then also seasonal changes. So that's basically the context of the study. And the big picture findings is that all three of these groups showed very similar patterns, almost identical. And some of them they were all spread, distanced by, there's a geographical difference between for all of them. Mm-hmm. And what the idea is that this might suggest that these people are expressing what is kind of a human Homo sapiens sleep, like the real core natural sleep, which I think is really, an interesting, I guess I wouldn't say a finding, but interpretation.
Right.
And yeah. So what did they find? And there's a lot of ways that natural sleep, we'll call it, is discussed. And oftentimes, depending on who's discussing it, it can be misinterpreted or, even worse, it can just be wrong in how somebody's phrasing it. But like, for example, hunter-gatherers would rise with the sun and go to bed when the sun would go down. Well, we know that's not true, even though they might not stay up as late as we do when we have artificial light that is stimulating arousal. We also know that hunter-gatherer groups would gather around fires and tell stories and dance pretty late. And so it's not just going to bed right after the sun went down. And in this study, they found that indeed, on average, these groups would go to sleep about 3.5 hours approximately after sunset. Mm-hmm. Thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
What are they doing? They're not watching TV, Dan.
Yeah, they're dancing.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're gonna stay up past dark, you should go dancing.
You just go dancing around a fire, right?
Yeah. I totally support that. Mm-hmm. So they also did not wake up with sunset, but would actually wake up before it. And what was really, really interesting to me was that what correlated most strongly with the time they would fall asleep and the time that they would wake up was actually body temperature. Mm-hmm. and ambient temperature, and how the sleep onset and sleep offset took place when there were drastic changes in ambient temperature, suggesting that as it's dropping later in the evening, then that would be a time for energy expenditure within a human to decrease, and this initiates the sleep onset period.
So this is why you often hear the recommendation of sleeping in a cool room rather than a warm room.
Yeah, that's right. And on another recommendation as well, which is if you're having some trouble sleeping, sometimes taking a hot bath or getting out of a hot tub can facilitate sleep onset. And the reason being is that when you go into a hot bath, you will vasodilate. Mm-hmm. And so that allows more core blood to go into your periphery. And when that happens, because you're warm, your body wants to try to actually get rid of body heat. Right. You step out of that hot environment, the heat leaves your body and you have a drop in core body temperature, and that can make you really drowsy. And anybody that's ever had, gotten out of a hot tub at night might feel drowsy and groggy. That's one of the reasons why, particularly if they go into a colder environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that is a couple of examples about how that can help. Another thing that also can help is taking a half of an aspirin, and that can lower core body temperature, and that can facilitate sleep onset. So that's, again, going back to temperature here. So they also noticed that when people would wake up, it had to do with when temperatures were rising and not necessarily when the sun was rising. So when it was starting to get a little bit warmer, mm-hmm. then they would experience some vasoconstriction, and that would then be alerting. So now let's talk about maybe the sleep periods. So, how long was sleep duration? So this is the big kind of main point that was discussed within a lot of the popular press articles. Right. And yeah, so sleep duration ranged from 5.7 hours to 7.1 hours. Okay, and that sounds pretty low. And in fact, a lot of the commentaries was that this is kind of near the low end of modern cultures, that this range. All right. But what's really important to note is that the sleep period, right? So there's the sleep duration, which is how long you slept, And then there's the sleep period, which is the time that you were actually sleeping, the period of time that you were sleeping. That was really average. That was about 7 to 8.5 hours per night, which is what I recommend.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because what's happening to your sleep in that period is difficult to say. There's a lot of things that are going to influence it. Sometimes you'll sleep more, and sometimes you'll sleep less. But you want to give your body adequate time for what I call complete sleep, which is allowing all of this homeostatic physiological processes that are taking place during sleep to not be interrupted by artificial means like an alarm clock.
Yeah, and let's be realistic about this. When most people hear the instruction to get 8 hours of sleep, they're going to go to bed at 10 and get out of bed at 6. They're not going to be determining how many of those 8 hours they're actually, they're not going to go to bed at 9 and wake up at 7 so that they can get 8 hours of sleep. Most people don't think about it that way. Right. But that's probably what is actually happening. Very few people are going to go to bed at 10 and wake up at 6 and actually get 8 hours of sleep in that interval.
That's right.
So the study, from a practical perspective, it doesn't change what the recommendations have been for, and what you've been saying, and I've been telling my audience for some time now.
Yeah, that's right. And an important point was brought up in the study in that, let's say you're monitoring your sleep and you're showing that you're not getting enough, you're not getting 8 hours, right? So that's what's recommended, 8 hours, let's say. And by the way, you cannot recommend, we've talked about this every time, you cannot recommend, let's say, population averages prescriptively to individuals. You can't look at a group of 100 people and say, okay, well, the average was 8 hours, therefore you need 8, because you could need more or less. So it's, right, you have your own individual sleep need. And some people sleep more, some people sleep less.
And we have a great article, guest post by you on my blog that helps people to help you determine how much sleep you need. So I think if you search for Chris Kresser, Dan Pardi, that should show up.
Yeah, that was. Thanks for giving me that opportunity to write that, because, like I said, it is a question I get very frequently, and it's nice to lay out the different factors, because the amount that you need can depend on different things, and depending on if you're fighting an infection, if you've been playing sports, it also, how much sleep do you need should be followed by for what, and you might perform perfectly well and not have any untoward health side effects from getting a little bit less sleep. But if you're trying to optimize cognition and information processing and memory and things like that, you might actually need to get more sleep. And so the way to do that is to then test the amount of sleep that you're getting and judge it by how well you think you're performing, how alert you are, and how sharp you feel the next day. So that's the best way to kind of assess that. And that's called sleep satisfaction, right? Is how satisfied are you by the sleep that you're getting? And if you feel kind of a persistent sleepiness, you don't feel very sharp, then maybe you can try to get, maybe you need more, and you should experiment with that.
Yeah. Okay. So what this study hasn't told us is that, again, in contrast to what some popular media stories have suggested, is that most people, it's normal for humans to sleep or to be in bed, let's say, for 5.5 or 6 hours a night, which is I think how it's been interpreted in some cases.
Yeah.
But what new information do you think it has highlighted, or things that if not new, just interesting angles? That there's the importance of temperature maybe in the room that is become a little bit more apparent with this study.
Yeah. So I didn't fully complete my last thought. So that's one of them, is that if you worry too much about getting 8 hours of sleep, let's say you're tracking it and you notice you're in bed for 8, but you're getting 6, don't worry. That's not uncommon. So a lot of these findings are not actually inconsistent with sleep findings from the lab. You'll bring somebody in the lab, they'll be there for 8 hours, but they'll sleep for 6 hours and 45 minutes. And so there's definitely a distinction between sleep period, which is the time that or sleep duration, or excuse me, in bed duration, right? The time that you're in bed.
Yeah.
And then the amount of sleep that you're getting. So those are two ways to kind of distinguish them, and they're important. So Yeah, the other finding was that, and which I thought was interesting, is they comment that light exposure did not have a big impact on sleep time. And for me, that wasn't too much of a surprise because their environment is consistent.
Right.
It has more of an effect on our life because our environment is very inconsistent. Our lighting environment is as if you were to take that, one of these groups, let's say, the sun, and you move them over several different time zones, and you plop them down one night, and the next night you move them back, and the next night you move them back. Right. That the rapidity of that change is really what we're inducing with the types of light that we're getting when we are up late one night watching television and go to bed early the next, and so that high variability in light exposure is then going to have effect on the timing of our circadian rhythms.
I also can't help wondering if, I know for myself, if I look at an iPad or something like that without my orange glasses on, blue light filtering glasses on late at night, it definitely does something to me and makes it harder for me to get to sleep. And I don't sleep as well that night. And maybe the exposure to blue light from an electronic device that's a couple feet away from your eyes is different than the light dark stimulation that they were getting in that ancestral environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you see every time that you half the distance of a light source to the eye, so for example, if you're holding an iPad out by 2 feet and you cut it to 1 foot, you quadruple the intensity of the light exposure because more of those photons are going straight into the eye. And if you think about where we tend to hold our iPads or phones, if we're laying down in bed, they're right up to our face.
Yeah.
And so even though they're not emitting very strong light in terms of lux units, which is the light intensity measurement, it is intense because it is going into our eye. Mm-hmm. And there was work out of Chuck Seisler's lab recently at Harvard, who's one of the kind of considered, the grandfather of circadian biology, that they had a study where they were looking at e-readers in your face at night, and they found that there was a significant impact of those sorts of devices on circadian timing. So it would cause a shift.
That's so interesting. Yeah, because I know like early versions of the Kindle were non-backlit, right? And then I think pretty much all Kindles that you can buy now, I'm not sure about the other devices because I'm not as familiar with them, but I'm pretty sure all Kindles now are backlit. So what should people be doing if they're reading a Kindle at night when it's dark? Is it better to turn down the backlighting as much as possible and use room light instead because it's warmer light, or, wear, blue light filtering glasses when they're reading, or some combination of the above?
Yeah. So I'd like to add, though, that my mentor, Jamie Zeitzer, who did his PhD under Chuck Seisler, he wrote a commentary on top of that paper that I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And he said that while the results are true, right, he didn't question, the results. He did question the relativeness of the environment they kept people in. So they kept people in very dim, dark environments across the day, and that would basically heighten sensitivity to light exposure at night.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah. That's a really important point.
Yeah. Wonder why they did that.
Well, I think a lot of times studies are designed to look at the capacity of a system, not necessarily like its sensitivity. So they kind of want to see if they can get an effect under the best case scenario. And if you can, then you might work to see how ecologically relevant that your findings can be. So you change the conditions to make them more naturalistic. And so that's a pretty common way to do it. You first try to game, so you can see if there's an effect exists at all. Because if not, under the best conditions, maybe not worth exploring further.
Right. That makes, because one of the recommendations we often make too is for people to get bright light exposure during the day, which has some effect on regulating the rhythm. And it's interesting to think about it from that perspective too. It's, if you get that exposure to brighter light, then you're maybe less sensitive to the light you might be exposed to later in the evening when the sun is down.
That's right. So that's why I always say get at least a half an hour of bright light exposure outside during the day, because that's going to anchor your circadian rhythm, and it's going to make it you much less sensitive to light exposure that you're experiencing at night. But a lot of people do work inside all day under, much less intense indoor light, environments, right? So you're, particularly during the winter where it's raining and cold outside, you're going to be inside under normal room light. So the chances that artificial light in the evening is going to cause an effect to shift your circadian rhythms is heightened. So yeah, just a good important point to make. It stresses to several things. Get outside during the day when you can, at least a half an hour. If you're going to have a break at work, go outside. If you're going to exercise, do it wherever you can. But if you can get outside and do it, that's great as well. There's additional benefits of from circadian rhythm alignment. And then in the evening, just like we were talking about, so there's not just the spectrum of light that will affect the activity of your master clock in the brain, but it's also light intensity. So you want to then dim all environmental lights. And then if I'm reading anything in bed, I always wear my blue blocking glasses. And that's going to then filter. It reduces the intensity a little bit, but it'll also pull out all the blue light in that spectrum of light. And it's that blue light that is the strongest at telling the brain that it is day. And that's what we want to avoid.
I just want to tell everyone that Dan has the fanciest, most stylish blue light blocking glasses that I've ever seen.
Well, thank you.
You gotta look good when you're blocking that blue light.
Right?
Doesn't matter, doesn't matter if you're alone by yourself in a dark room. You never know what's gonna happen.
No, I do it for my wife. I don't.
It's good. No, yeah. I've been trying. As we speak, I'm actually wearing some yellow tinted glasses. So I don't think they block out much blue light, but they're glasses made for gamers. I just find that they reduce my eye strain during the day when I'm looking at the computer a lot.
Yeah,
and then so I wear these intermittently, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but I have to say that I've been going with the blue blockers at night.
Yeah,
I remember the like QVC ads, when we were growing up, blue blockers, and of course I never knew what they were until I learned more about this stuff, that they were actually blocking blue light. Yeah, and I think they claim to block almost 100%. I don't know if that's ever been verified, but I'll tell you that I've tried now 3 or 4 different, brands or types of blue light blocking glasses, and I find that the blue blockers, I have their wraparounds, they have a panel as part of the wraparound that's orange also, so it pretty much covers the whole eye area, and I notice a big difference just a few minutes after I put them on at night.
They do block 100% of blue light, and the Gunner yellow tinted will cut the blue light in about half. And what's interesting is that cutting some blue light during the day can actually make people feel more calm, because because again, blue light is alerting. So some people perform better when they use some blue light blocking during the day at the office, because it makes them feel more calm, and then that makes them feel more productive, which is interesting. It's only a problem if you're then not getting outside to get adequate daylight during the day.
Right.
Yeah. So if you're going to do that, get outside. You got to get outside.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. I've made a point now when I go outside not to wear sunglasses typically, unless I'm going to be outside for a while, or I'm at the beach or something like that, and even then I'll spend the first hour or something without sunglasses. Yeah. So let's talk just briefly, since we're finishing up here. I'm going to the UK on Saturday, and I'm gone for a couple of weeks. So I'm gonna and Dan has helped me with my strategy for traveling, because I want to try to time shift my rhythm as much as possible beforehand, so I can ease the transition into this time zone, which is 8 hours ahead. So I have my glasses, and I have my melatonin. So tell everyone what you advise regarding melatonin for me and why. And then we didn't talk about how I could use my glasses possibly to help with that shift. So let's do that too, because I know a lot of people listening to this do a lot of traveling as well across time zones.
Yeah, I get it a lot. So let's think how melatonin is usually taken supplementally. People take it before bed to try to induce sleep, and the effects of melatonin are pretty weak as a sleep inducer, but they're there. And so part of the effects of aiding sleep initiation is placebo, right? So if you think it's working, then you're more likely to really relax and help it go to sleep. And if there's even just a little bit of an effect and you think that you're taking it for a specific reason, it's going to augment the placebo effect. So that's how most people take it. Now let's look in your case. What are you doing? You're going to be taking melatonin in a small dose, 0.5 to 1 milligrams, to adjust your circadian rhythm by up to 3 hours a day. That's kind of the maximal amount that you can shift your rhythm. And you're going to do that ahead of time, several days ahead of time, so that when you arrive in the UK, you're not going to have to adjust 9 hours, but you might be in a place where you only have to adjust, 3, 4, or 5, right? So you at least cut it in half or more. Depends on how much you try to adjust between now and then. Mm-hmm. I always save a little bit of adjusting for when I arrive, just because it's easier than trying to fully adjust, while I'm here.
Right, because then you could run the risk of disrupting your schedule where you are, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that just isn't practical for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So what I tend to try to do in your case is I'll try to go to bed. I look at when is it getting dark in where I'm going? And then what time is that here where I am? And at that time, here where I am, I will then start to take melatonin daily, 3 to 4 days out before I leave. So that might be noon or 2 p.m. in the afternoon, depending on, again, where you're going. And you just take a half a milligram, and then I might take a half a milligram 4 or 5 hours later. But what you're doing when you do that is you're not necessarily facilitating any sleepiness, but you are telling the brain you're starting to initiate the process of phase shifting. Mm-hmm. And you also want to try to go to bed earlier the first few days, the days preceding leaving, and then also get up earlier as well. So you're already shifting before you arrive.
Right. And so if I wanted to accelerate that, would I consider putting on my blue blockers a little earlier in the day as well?
Absolutely. Right. So you usually put them on in the evening to block the blue light from artificial light. But in this case, you'd put them on maybe starting at 4 in the afternoon. And so you'd have some melatonin earlier than that in supplemental form, where the blue blocker starting maybe at 4, and then try to go to bed early and wake up early. And that's a pretty good way to do it.
So if I wanted to really take this to the next level, I could also have like a bright light. When I wake up in the morning, let's say if I wake up before dark, I could have like a light machine and get some bright light exposure in my eyes, or would just normal daylight at the normal time be enough?
You could get bright light exposure early in the morning. That's another shifter of your circadian rhythm. Mm-hmm. So I would always, that's always a good thing to do. So you're managing light environment across the kind of the 24-hour period. Yeah. And so first thing in the morning, getting bright light exposure. And actually, that's another very interesting point to the study by Jerry Siegel. They did measure light and exposure, and they got a lot of these hunter-gatherer communities got a lot of light exposure early in the morning, first thing in the morning. Mm-hmm. Then around noon, when it was hottest, the light intensity and the exposure would dim because they would be temperature regulating under trees when it was really hot. So I thought that was very fascinating as well. So it could suggest another mechanism for why getting light in the morning is a good idea.
Fascinating. Thanks so much for coming back on the show, Dan. I'm sure this will help a lot of people and eliminate a lot of potential misunderstanding from that recent study.
Thanks for having me back on the show. Always a pleasure.
That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/Chris Kresser or facebook.com/Chris Kresser L.A.C. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.